So thank you very much for inviting me. I am director of something called the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Unit. There's only one of those in the UK, and I think that's part of the reason why you got in touch with us in the first place. So the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Unit is situated in London, in that rather nice looking old building that you can see reflected in another part of the medical school where I work. So I'm going to be talking about pragmatic trials. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, talk about some issues, and then I said some emerging designs. One of those designs is cluster randomized trials, and really I think that's emerged. It's not still emerging, but the design that is emerging at the moment is step wedge designs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about step wedge designs. So I'm going to talk about what pragmatic trials are, when you conduct them, and then spend quite a lot of time, most of the talk, talking about how they should be conducted and covering cluster randomized trials and step wedge designs. I'm aware that I'm talking in English, and English is probably not the first language of most people. Also that I'm going to be talking about examples which come from the UK, and they may not always transfer that easily into Belgium. So I would be very happy if people interrupt me as I go along. In fact, when I talk, I prefer that. So if you have questions, comments, or you can't understand what I'm saying, then please interrupt me as I go along. I'll be very happy to be interrupted. So I'm going to start with what is a pragmatic trial, and I think I'm really delighted to be here in this year, because this is 50 years since Schwartz and Lelouch's seminal paper on pragmatic trials, which they introduced the terminology pragmatic into the trials literature. It had not been used before in the trials literature. And in that paper they make this distinction between pragmatic trials, which they say are designed to help choose between care options, and explanatory trials, which they say are designed to test causal research hypotheses, usually about biological and chemical processes. So about 30 years later, Martin Rowland and David Torgerson in the British Medical Journal put a slightly different perspective on this, and they define pragmatic trials as those that measure effectiveness, what will actually happen in routine clinical practice, or some people like to think of that as the real world, and explanatory trials as being those that evaluate efficacy. That's what kind of effect the treatment will produce when it's in ideal conditions. Just a couple of things about those definitions. I think when Schwartz and Lelouch first proposed their definitions, they were thinking, and if you read their paper, they're thinking largely about drug trials. Since then, things have really moved on, and a lot of these trials are no longer drug trials. So we are talking about drug trials, but we're also talking about non-drug trials. And if you take the definition that Rowland and Torgerson have of effectiveness in routine clinical practice, actually some of the trials, at least some of the trials that go through our clinical trials unit, they aren't things that you can slot into routine clinical practice. They are actually changing clinical practice. So they're changing the organisation of healthcare. So there are some differences, but I think these definitions have largely stood the test of time. However, in the past 15 or so years, there's been more of a recognition that in fact this is not a dichotomy between pragmatic and explanatory. It's more like a spectrum, with very explanatory trials at one end and very pragmatic trials at the other end, and trials in the middle which can be a mixture of explanatory and pragmatic. And so we might ask, rather than is a trial pragmatic or is it explanatory, how pragmatic or how explanatory is it? That might be a better question. And one of the tools we can use to answer that question is the Precis tool. Now, Precis was a tool, Precis 1 preceded Precis 2, so it's a tool that's been around for a little while, and it was devised in order to help people design their trials, but you can also use it to assess how pragmatic or explanatory a trial is. So I'm just going to explain how that works. So with the Precis 2 tool, you have, let's see if I can get this to work. Yes. So with the Precis 2 tool, you have these 9 domains, and what you're attempting to do is to assess a trial for each of these domains. For each of the domains, how pragmatic is it, how explanatory is it? And if it's very explanatory, you score the trial 1 here, so that an explanatory trial, a trial that was very explanatory, you draw a little wheel like this, and that would represent an explanatory trial. If the trial is pragmatic on any of these domains, then you score it up at this end at 5. So if you have a very pragmatic trial, then you would draw it on the wheel like this. It will be a nice large circle. So that's the idea of the Precis 2 wheel. And just to give a little bit more, sort of a little bit more meat on the bones of that, these are my words. They're not words taken out of the paper written by those who devised the Precis 2 tool, but my words, I think, which represent the sort of extreme end of a very pragmatic trial and the extreme end of a very explanatory trial. So I won't go through them all, but just a few. So if we take the top one, for example, in a very pragmatic trial, we want to have participants in our trial that are completely representative of the population to whom the intervention might eventually be rolled out if it's shown to be successful. Whereas in an explanatory trial, we want highly selected participants. And the reason we want highly selected participants is we want this trial to be in ideal conditions where everything works perfectly and all those participants take the intervention exactly as they are supposed to if it's a drug. Or something like that. So that's one difference. If we move down a little bit further to settings, so in a pragmatic trial, the setting is key because we're trying to assess what will happen if we put this intervention into the real world. We want the setting to be the setting where the results will apply and where the intervention will eventually be used. In an explanatory trial, we're not so concerned about the setting. What we're more concerned about is that the conditions of the trial are very tightly controlled so we can get the right answer about the biological processes or whatever the processes are that we're interested in. If we move down a little bit further, you can see there's a couple of items there about flexibility. So in a pragmatic trial, we want this to mirror as much as possible what would happen in real life. So there's some flexibility in terms of those delivering the intervention. We don't make them deliver it in exactly the same way. And there's some flexibility in adherence. If people don't like the pills that we're giving them, then, and we ask them to take them 5 times a day and they decide to only take them 3 times a day or not at all, then that kind of flexibility is allowed in a pragmatic trial because we want to see what would happen in real life. And those sorts of things happen in real life. If we look at the next item, follow-up exactly as it would be in usual care. That's very difficult to do, and it's very difficult to have a trial that's at the very pragmatic end there, because follow-up exactly as you would do it in primary care, in usual care, means that you don't have anything in the trial which adds an extra burden onto your participants in terms of outcome collection. So you might, for example, collect outcomes from routine data so that all the participants were exposed to was the intervention, but not to an extra burden of data collection. That would make your trial very pragmatic, but it's not always possible to do because of the kind of outcomes that you want to collect. Whereas in an explanatory trial, you usually have much more extensive follow-up. You want to know exactly what's going on with your participants in your explanatory trial. So that just gives you a flavour of those different domains, and we can score any trial on a range between one of those two extremes. So within the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Unit, a couple of years ago, we did this exercise where we looked at a number of our trials. We are called the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Unit. So when people come to us, the expectation is that they are doing a pragmatic trial. But we wanted to see how pragmatic are these trials using the Precis wheel. And you can see there's a whole mixture. So for example, this one here, which is the same as the one over on the board here, looks very pragmatic. Similarly, this one here Similarly, this one here looks very pragmatic. Interestingly, those three are all cluster randomized trials. Now, we haven't gone into that very much further to work out whether it's the fact that they're cluster randomized trials that makes them very pragmatic, because the other feature about them is that they are also all screening trials. So is it a screening trial or is it a cluster randomized trial that makes it very pragmatic? But there's something about these trials that makes them very pragmatic. On the other hand, if you look at some of these, for example, this one down here, it doesn't look so pragmatic. Some of the domains are scored much nearer the centre than they are in the very pragmatic trials. And all of those ones, all these three down this side and this one, these are all individually randomized trials. So, when do pragmatic trials arise? If we take that explanatory pragmatic sort of continuum, spectrum, a lot of people think of this in terms of drug trials, and then see a sort of transition between explanatory trials, which is where you start your drug development, and then right at the end of your drug development you get your pragmatic trial. So that trials at the left-hand end are done in ideal conditions, and the conditions get more and more like real life as you move across that spectrum. So right at the far left end, you're really asking, can this treatment possibly work? If we have everything ideal, can it possibly work? And right on the far right, you have the question, does this treatment actually work in real life when things are no longer ideal? So this sort of pattern is, if you put in the basic science which precedes your drug trials, then this sort of development is often termed the translational pathway. Translational pathway, it can be a little bit more complicated than what I've shown, but it's a translation from the bench right to the bedside is what people often say. That we're starting with lab science and we're ending up with something which is useful to patients. And many pragmatic trials end up being done with drugs because there's been a lot of drug development beforehand, and then we want to see whether these drugs work in real life. Sometimes the translational pathway is not as simple as that. So this is a trial that we have done within the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Unit, and it was a trial looking at the drug montelukast to see whether that could reduce unscheduled medical attendances for wheezing amongst preschool children. Now, montelukast had been used in adults and it had been used in other settings, but it had not been used in this sort of setting, because what the investigators were trying to do in this trial was to see whether they could get parents to administer montelukast. So the parents were trained and they were given boxes of montelukast or boxes of placebo, and they were told, administer this when this happens to your child, and let's see if that prevents wheezing. So it's not quite a straightforward translational pathway, but it is a trial that sort of occurs at the end of a lot of drug development. And this is the Precis wheel for that particular trial. So if you look at this, you can see that there are two domains, the recruitment domain and the follow-up domain, where this trial doesn't look particularly pragmatic. And the reasons for that were that in the recruitment domain, this was quite a large trial. We needed over 1,000 parents and children to run this trial. Because of that, we needed to recruit our children and their parents from other settings other than the setting where this trial would eventually be rolled out. So that's the reason why the recruitment doesn't look so pragmatic. In terms of the follow-up doesn't look so pragmatic because these parents were telephoned frequently, and also they were asked to fill in diaries about their children's respiratory health. Now that wouldn't happen in usual care, but it needed to happen in the trial, partly because of safety. So that's the reason why this trial doesn't look quite as pragmatic as it might. So another trial done in sort of completely different circumstances is the STOP trial. That's ongoing at the moment. We're just finishing the pilot. We're just moving to the main trial. And it's done in pharmacies in the UK. Though it's done in pharmacies, it has nothing to do with drugs. In the UK, a lot of pharmacies offer smoking cessation services. And what this trial was aiming to do was to take population of pharmacies and give an intervention to some pharmacies and not others to see if we could increase the proportion of their customers who would actually stop smoking. So this was a cluster randomised trial, and I'll come back to cluster randomised trials in detail in a bit. The intervention was training and support for the pharmacists to help them to help their customers, and the control was no training and support. So this is not a pragmatic trial done at the end of drug development. This is a pragmatic trial where actually what we wanted to do was to try and implement something that would help people stop smoking. We already know that stopping smoking is good, but how do you actually implement that? So that was that trial. And these are the Precis wheels for stop. It was cluster randomised, so it looks pretty pragmatic at the pharmacy level. And we did this exercise with the trial teams, and the trial team in this case decided they wanted to do another Precis wheel at the individual level because it was cluster randomised. They had 2 levels. This also looks pretty pragmatic, but there are various domains that they decided were not relevant at the individual level. So moving on to the next trial, NESS. This is treating negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So this is a completely different trial. This is our population here is people with schizophrenia, and our outcome rather is the PANSS score, which measures negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and the hope was that this intervention that we were going to use would reduce negative symptoms. So the intervention was body psychotherapy. Is there anybody in the room who knows what body psychotherapy is? Okay, well, I'll explain it as best I can. So body psychotherapy, it's a group therapy, but it's not to do with talking, it's to do with movement, and it's also to do with touching. So you can see that from this, well, I don't know whether you can see it very well, but from this picture I got off the internet, these are all people lying on the floor, kind of touching various bits of each other. So that was our intervention, and in this trial we decided that we would have a control, almost like a placebo. So the control was Pilates. Anybody done Pilates? Then you'll be more familiar with that, I expect. So that has the same aspect. It's a group therapy, it's to do with movement, but the touching is not there. So the key part of the body psychotherapy, or what we thought would be the key part, is not present in that. So this is a trial where it's not at the end of drug development, but neither is it a trial like the previous one I showed you where we're trying to implement something that we know is already good for people, stopping smoking. This is a trial, pragmatic trial, which you can't really think of doing any other way than pragmatically. How would you do this in ideal conditions? What would ideal conditions even be for this population group? There is only one way to do this trial as a pragmatic trial. Yeah.
Can I ask what you put in the informed consent?
Oh, it's a good question. If you're asking me details, I'm not sure I can remember. But we would have said to... I'm sure we would have said to people that we were doing a trial where either they would get body psychotherapy and then there would be an explanation of body psychotherapy, or they would get Pilates. Yeah. Is that what you wanted to know?
Explain the intervention.
Yes, I'm sure we must have explained the interventions to them. Yes, yes. Because otherwise, I mean, if you think about it, otherwise in this kind of trial, you would have to do that when you informed them, because otherwise if you said something vague to them and then you offered them this, they would have to know that that's the sort of thing that they were being offered. Otherwise I think you get a lot of dropout. Yeah. Okay, so in summary then, pragmatic trials do occur in translational research at the end of that translational pathway. But a lot of the ones that we encounter in the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Unit are to do with implementation research. How do we implement something that we already know is a good idea? And then thirdly, they're done because there's no other possibility for doing a trial. It's got to be pragmatic. So, how should these trials be conducted? Okay, I'm not going to go through absolutely everything that one should do when doing these trials, but I'm very happy for people to, as I say, interrupt me if you don't think I'm covering something that you want covered. So I'm going to cover interventions and outcomes a bit, talk about ethics and regulations, bias, then get on to cluster randomised trials and step wedge designs, and then just raise the issue of reporting very briefly. So interventions, one of the key things in pragmatic trials is defining what the intervention is. And I've already said it's often not a drug. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about the definition of the intervention in pragmatic trials and about the development of interventions for many pragmatic trials that are not evaluating drugs. And description, I'll put that in brackets because I'm going to come to that at the reporting at the end, but only cover it very briefly. So, in intervention definition, in an explanatory trial, the definition of the intervention is usually quite straightforward. It's a drug, it's a device, it's some kind of therapy, that's your intervention. But if you think about pragmatic trials, and if you think about the NEST trial, where we had the body psychotherapy, then the intervention there is not actually the body psychotherapy itself, it's the offer of therapy. These participants were offered body psychotherapy. They could go to the sessions or they needn't go to the sessions. It was up to them whether they attended or not. So actually what we're giving them is the offer of therapy, and we allow for there to be some non-adherence. It's one of the key things about the difference between pragmatic and explanatory trials, that non-adherence is treated in a different way. We allow there to be non-adherence because that is what would happen in the real world, and we are trying to assess our therapy in the real world. The other thing about pragmatic trials is that often your intervention, particularly say for cluster randomised trials, is not aimed at individual participants, but it might be aimed at professionals. Now you might be asking the professionals to do something specific, but the intervention itself is aimed at them. It's not aimed directly at individual participants. So just to talk, I think I've got these slides a little bit out of kilter, but never mind. We'll go on to the development of interventions in a bit. But just to talk a little bit about data collection first. So there are some key issues in data collection in pragmatic trials, and I think this is an area which hasn't really been very well worked out. This is one of the key areas, I think, for future research. So one of the things that people often ask in pragmatic trials is, what should my primary outcome be? And there's a whole variety of answers to that question. It really depends on the trial. You can also ask, should there only be one primary outcome, or can we have co-primary outcomes? Can we have more than one primary outcome? One of the criticisms of a lot of pragmatic trials is that they don't go on long enough, that actually you're measuring something, but actually it's not really important to patients and decision makers whether their pain is reduced 3 months after the intervention. It's more important whether it's reduced 3 years after the intervention, but you don't go on and collect data or run the trial for long enough to find that out. In some situations, you can get bias in data collection if you're doing something slightly different in terms of your intervention and control groups, how to avoid that, and how much data to collect. So I'm going to give you an example. This example is a COPAS trial recently published in PLOS Medicine. So this was a trial of self-management groups for chronic pain. And so the aim was to get to, chronic pain is known as a very intractable problem. A lot of people suffer from chronic pain and they get this treatment and that treatment, drug treatments, other kinds of talking therapies, and nothing changes. So this was a group therapy to address chronic pain. However, it's known that pain itself is very, very difficult to change. So the actual intervention was designed to help people with their self-efficacy to manage pain. In other words, to help them to be more confident about managing their pain. That's what the intervention was designed to do. And we knew when we started the trial that if you help people to be more confident about managing their pain, then that will also affect other outcomes. So we were hoping there will be other outcomes that might be affected. So we decided to measure various things, and I haven't got the whole list here, but things like depression, anxiety, social integration, and pain-related disability. The question was, which one of these should be our primary outcome? Which one of these would really help decision makers to make a decision about whether to introduce this intervention or not? So we went for pain-related disability. That was the one that we chose. We thought that was the one decision makers would say, well, if people can do more after this intervention than they previously could, then perhaps we will introduce this intervention. So unfortunately, when the trial results came out, there was not a significant difference in pain-related disability between the intervention and control groups. There was, however, a significant difference in depression at 12 months, and there was a significant difference in social integration at 12 months. So the question is, should we really have had co-primary outcomes? How should we have helped decision makers to make decisions in this particular trial? The other issue about this trial is it was relatively cheap and therefore probably quite cost effective. So do we have to put that into the equation in terms of our decision making as well? And I think, as I say, I don't have any answers to that. They are questions, but I think that this is something where we need to do a lot more work thinking about outcomes. What outcomes do we collect? How long for? Can we have co-primary outcomes? How do our outcomes really help decision makers?
So
Yeah.
This is about chronic pain.
Yes.
The intervention cannot be blinded. Again, the informed consent says
Yes.
you're in self-management.
Yes.
Or not.
Oh, you're not. Yes.
Has that discussion taken place on the endpoints? Is this considered robust
Yeah.
enough?
I think that's another issue, because obviously if you're asking people about their pain-related disability, you've got to ask the people themselves, and they know whether they had the self-management intervention or whether they didn't. And so it's not knowing that they had the intervention itself that matters, because that is what would happen in real life. It's the fact that they know there was another group that didn't get the intervention. Therefore, the group that did get the intervention might have thought, obviously, I'm better off.
And the other group
Might have thought, might have felt they missed something. So we haven't, I think that is another issue in outcomes, and we haven't teased that out in this study or any other, but I think particularly for self-reported outcomes, that's an issue again that we need to address. I mean, in this trial, it so happened that our primary outcome was not statistically significant, so we don't really have that issue. We had essentially a negative trial, although some of the secondary outcomes were statistically significant. So, but I think it's an issue that we do need to address, yeah.